Hello, and thank you for joining us for the Stations of the Cross service here at Southport Congregational Church. Good Friday is the most difficult day of Holy Week and of the entire year. It's a painful path to walk and to hear about and to take in. All the joy and anticipation of Palm Sunday has turned to treachery and betrayal. Judas Iscariot, the disciple who betrayed Jesus, was so overcome with remorse that he hanged himself early Friday morning. Meanwhile, from the moment of Jesus' arrest in the Garden of Gethsemane until the last moment of his life, Jesus suffered. Before he was laid to rest in a borrowed tomb, he was spit upon, abused, beaten, mocked, and tortured. His torture was not only physical in nature, but emotional and spiritual as well. And at 3 p.m., he breathed his last. Why? For all of humanity. Because the Bible tells us, for God so loved the world that God gave his only begotten Son, so that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have everlasting life. As Jesus himself taught his disciples on more than one occasion, the cross symbolizes something far more than suffering and death, and perhaps even more significant than theologies of the atonement. The cross is about faithfulness, servanthood, and the commitment of one to another that will not abandon that commitment even when rejected. In short, the cross is about the power of love, the commitment of God to humanity, the faithfulness and grace of God that knows no limits and that is without boundaries, that will risk even death itself for the sake of new life. The Stations of the Cross is a liturgical way to reenact that journey as a meditation of worship and scripture and an act of devotion to God. To think that the event of Jesus' journey to the cross was a one-time event in history is to misunderstand the role of remembering. For in remembering this event by walking the Stations of the Cross, we are not just reenacting a 2,000-year-old event. We come along with that journey. We are making our own journey. And in the process, we are confessing our own dependence upon God. So join us and let's walk together these final hours of Jesus' life as we hear the story and contemplate its meaning for our own lives, step by step, until the end.
And so we begin with the first station, following the Last Supper. Jesus went with them to a place called Gethsemane, and Jesus said to his disciples, "Sit here while I go yonder and pray." And taking with him Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee, James and John, he began to be sorrowful and troubled. Then Jesus said to them, "My soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch with me." And going a little farther, he fell on his face and prayed, "My Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as thou will be done." And Jesus came to the disciples and found them sleeping. And he said to Peter, "So could you not watch with me but for 1 hour? Watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit is indeed willing, but the flesh is weak." Again, for the second time, Jesus went away and prayed, "My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but thy will be done." And again, Jesus came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were heavy. So leaving them again, he went away and prayed for the third time, saying the same words. Then he came to the disciples and said to them, "Are you still sleeping and taking your rest? Behold, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand." It's no accident that Jesus went into a garden for this prayer of suffering when humanity's suffering also began in a garden, in the Garden of Eden. Jesus took with him 3 men who had been with him during the Transfiguration, because Peter, James, and John had seen him in all his glory. They were the ones best equipped to be there to witness his suffering. The words Jesus spoke were ones of dejection, anguish, and horror, the state of mind of someone who is surrounded with sorrows, overwhelmed with miseries, and almost swallowed up with terror and dismay. This is the moment that we see Jesus become truly anxious and extremely distressed. There is a rare condition called hemohydrosis, in which it has been recorded that under extreme stress, humans do, in fact, sweat blood. In his prayers, in which we hear the most human Jesus, we can almost hear him beg God not to let the upcoming events happen. It is a rare insight into Jesus' humanity when he prayed that, if possible, the cup might pass from him. But his last words also showed that he was finally ready to carry the load of his sufferings, and that he was willing to be humiliated and beaten and tortured and ultimately killed for our redemption and salvation. If we are to honor the gifts of the cross, then we must remember that life is difficult. There are bitter cups that we all must drink from, and we can fight against it, but at some time we have to submit to it if we are going to conquer it, remembering that our lives are in the hands of the one who neither slumbers nor sleeps. Jesus shows us that we all will be tempted, and to avoid temptation, we should watch and pray and continually be reaching for God, not alone, but with the friends who have seen the best and the worst of us, the friends with whom we share a love for God and a love for each other. And then together, we will be able to say, "Nevertheless, not as I will, but as thy will be done."
Now the betrayer had given them a sign, saying, "The one I shall kiss is the man. Seize him." And he came up to Jesus at once and said, "Hail, Master," and he kissed him. Jesus said, "Judas, would you betray me with a kiss?" Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen to him, went out and asked the crowd, "Who is it you want?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "I am he," Jesus said. When Jesus said, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. Again, he asked them, "Who is it you want?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they said. Jesus answered, "I told you that I am he. If you are looking for me, then let these men," his disciples, "go." This happened so that the words he had spoken would be fulfilled. "I have not lost one of those you gave me." Then they came up and laid hands on Jesus and seized him. And behold, one of those who were with Jesus stretched out his hand and drew his sword and struck the slave of the high priest and cut off his ear. Then Jesus said to him, "Put your sword back into its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword. Do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will at once send me more than 12 legions of angels? But how then should the scriptures be fulfilled, that it must be so?" At that hour, Jesus said to the crowds, "Have you come out against a robber, as against a robber, with swords and clubs to capture me? Day after day I sat in the temple teaching, and you did not seize me. But all this has taken place, that the scriptures of the prophets might be fulfilled." Then all the disciples abandoned him and fled. A new garden, a new Adam, a new Genesis for God's people is about to take place. In Eden, God came looking for humanity. In Gethsemane, men come looking for God, but they didn't even realize it. They had no idea of the part of the plan that they'd play out. They thought they were just doing their job. But unlike Adam and Eve, Jesus didn't hide. He didn't really have any reason to. God had given him a cup to drink from, and he had agreed to drink it. If we doubt Jesus' divinity at this time, look back at the phrase he uses when they are looking for Jesus. "I am he." I am. The same name God gave to Moses when Moses demanded God give him a name. "I am the resurrection and the life. I am the light of the world." And when the soldiers heard it, clearly there was some sort of divine understanding as they all drew back and fell to the ground. The guards' reactions were the same ones that others had when they met God face to face. This man standing there in the garden was the one who for the rest of eternity will be equal with God. And isn't it interesting that Jesus stepped out to them, taking the initiative to begin what is to happen? He's calm. He's in command of the situation, of both his followers and those who have come to arrest him. And so it begins. As they take him away to Caiaphas, the high priest, we see the irony. The true high priest will be sent to his death by the false one. The true Adam, Son of God, will be sent to his death by the false ones. And when this is done, the garden will be restored. And instead of bloodshed and pain, there will be love and healing and forgiveness.
Then those who had seized Jesus led him to Caiaphas, the high priest of the Jewish temple, where the scribes and the elders had gathered. But Peter followed him at a distance, as far as the courtyard of the high priest. And going inside, he sat with the guards to see the end. Now the chief priests and the whole council sought false testimony against Jesus, that they might put him to death. But they found none, though many false witnesses came forward. At last, 2 came forward. And they said, "This fellow said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and to build it in 3 days." And the high priest stood up and said, "Have you no answer to make? What is it that these men testify against you?" But Jesus was silent. And the high priest said to him, "I adjure you by the living God, tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God." And Jesus said to him, "You have said so. But I tell you, hereafter you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." Then the high priest tore his robes and said, "He has uttered blasphemy. Why do we still need witnesses? You have now heard his blasphemy. What is your judgment?" And they answered, "He deserves death." Then they spat in Jesus' face and struck him, and some slapped him, saying, "Prophesy to us, you Christ. Who is it that struck you?" When Judas, his betrayer, saw that Jesus was condemned, he repented and brought back the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and elders. He said, "I have sinned by betraying innocent blood." But they said, "What is that to us? See to it yourself." And throwing down the pieces of silver in the temple, Judas departed and went and hanged himself. But the chief priests, taking the pieces of silver, said, "It is not lawful to put them into the treasury, since they are blood money." And after conferring together, they used them to buy the potter's field as a place to bury foreigners. For this reason, that field has been called the field of blood to this day. Then was fulfilled what had been spoken through the prophet Jeremiah, and they took the 30 pieces of silver, the price of the one on whom a price had been set, on whom some of the people of Israel had set a price, and they gave them for the potter's field, as the Lord commanded me. And when the day came, the assembly of the elders of the people, both chief priests and scribes, gathered together, and they brought Jesus to their temple council, and they said, "If you are the Messiah, tell us." Jesus replied, "If I tell you, you will not believe. And if I question you, you will not answer. But from now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the power of God." And all of them asked, "Are you then the Son of God?" And Jesus said to them, "You say that I am." And then they said, "What further testimony do we need? We have heard it ourselves from his own lips." Then the assembly rose as a body and brought Jesus before Pilate. And they began to accuse him, saying, "We found this man perverting our nation, forbidding us to pay taxes to the emperor, and saying that he himself is the Messiah, a king." Then Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus answered, "You say so." Then Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowds, "I find no basis for your accusation against this man." But they were insistent and said, "He stirs up the people by teaching them throughout all Judea, from Galilee where he began, even to this place." And when Pilate heard this, he asked whether the man was a Galilean. And when he learned that he was under Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him off to Herod, who was himself in Jerusalem at that time. And when Herod saw Jesus, he was very glad, for he had been wanting to see him for a long time, because he had heard about him and was hoping to see him perform some sign. Herod questioned Jesus at some length, but Jesus gave him no answer. And the chief priests and the scribes stood by, vehemently accusing him. Even Herod with his soldiers treated him with contempt and mocked him. Then Herod put an elegant robe on him and sent him back to Pilate. That same day, Herod and Pilate became friends with each other. Before this, they had been enemies. Pilate then called together the chief priests and the leaders and the people and said to them, "You brought me this man as one who was perverting the people. And here I have examined him in your presence and have not found this man guilty of any of your charges against him. Neither has Herod, for he sent him back to us. Indeed, he has done nothing to deserve death. I will therefore have him flogged and released." Lies, beatings, mockery, and misunderstanding. These are some of what Jesus faced after his arrest. 3 fake trials by the Jewish leaders, followed by 3 mock trials by the Roman leaders. It seemed no one could really figure out how to close this. The Jewish leaders had waited and plotted for 3 years to catch Jesus, but now that they had him, they still needed the Romans to finish him off. But the Romans saw no harm. Nothing that Jesus had said or done goes against their laws. And for 3 years, they had gone back and forth about this with the Jewish leaders. 3 years of listening to the Jewish leaders lying about Jesus, intentionally misrepresenting him, looking to trap him with every word spoken. That is true sin. Intentional breaking from God's will to serve one's own purposes. And the Romans were basically fed up with the constant power struggle between themselves and these Jewish leaders. But look at who finally comes together in order to put an end to Jesus. A Jewish king and a Gentile ruler. 2 leaders who have despised each other for years. But on that day, they find a commonality. It is because of the Prince of Peace, a man who had spent 3 years preaching about bringing together Jews and Gentiles, young and old, taxpayers and Samaritans. This man had one last reconciliation, a Jew and a Gentile, both non-believers. Herod and Pilate reconciling their differences. It's almost as if when Jesus is around, reconciliation cannot help but to take place.
We follow with Station 4, where Peter denies Jesus 3 times. Following the Last Supper, after the meal and when they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. Then Jesus said to them, "You will all fall away because of me this night. For it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. But after I am raised up, I will go before you to Galilee." Peter declared to him, "Though they all fall away because of you, I will never fall away." Jesus said to him, "Truly I say to you, this very night, before the cock crows, you will deny me 3 times. Peter said to him, "Even if I must die with you, I will not deny you." And so said all the disciples. Later that evening, after Jesus had been arrested, now Peter was sitting outside in the courtyard, and a maid came up to him and said, "You also were with Jesus, the Galilean." But he denied it before them all, saying, I do not know what you mean." And when he went out to the porch, another maid saw him, and she said to the bystanders, "This man was with Jesus of Nazareth." And being scared for his own life, again he denied it with an oath, "I do not know this man." After a little while, the bystanders came up and said to Peter, "Certainly you are also one of them, for your accent betrays you." Then he began to invoke a curse upon himself and to swear, "I do not know the man." And immediately the cock crowed. And Peter remembered the sayings of Jesus, "Before the cock crows, you will deny me 3 times." And he went out and wept bitterly. What must it have felt like to be Jesus at the moment of the Last Supper, when he looked around the table at the 12 men who had given up everything to follow him, to share in his ministry, to learn all that he had to teach, and to understand that not one, but 2 of them would betray him before the night was over. Judas, he may have understood better. He came from a zealot background, and he was looking for an uprising to defeat the Roman occupation. But Peter, the one to whom he said, "You are Peter," which means the rock, "and upon this rock I shall build my church." And when he confronted Peter about it, Peter denied it to him, face to face. And yet when the time came, he did it anyway. Peter's story is a human story. We want to do good. We know what we need to do. But we get scared, or things go against us, and we falter. We lose our bearings. We cave into our weaknesses and let them control us, and we separate ourselves from God, which is the very definition of sin. And the good news? God loves us through our sinfulness. And when we do err, God does not want us to fall into the depths of despair as Judas did. God wants us to come to him, to be embraced in God's love, and to reconcile ourselves to that love. After all, God is complete. God created us because God wanted to love us, not because God needs us to love him. Peter's story is a human story, and from the cross, we are all forgiven for it.
Station 5, in which Jesus accepts his cross. Then the Jewish leaders took Jesus from Caiaphas to the palace of the Roman governor. By now it was early morning, and to avoid ceremonial uncleanness, they did not enter the palace, because they wanted to be able to eat the Passover. So Pilate came out to them and asked, "What charges are you bringing against this man?" "If he were not a criminal," they replied, "we would not have handed him over to you." Pilate said, "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law." "But we have no right to execute anyone," they objected. This took place to fulfill what Jesus had said about the kind of death he was going to die. Pilate then went back inside the palace, summoned Jesus, and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" That is your own idea," Jesus replied. "Or did the others talk to you about me?" "Am I a Jew?" Pilate replied. "Your own people and chief priests handed you over to me. What is it you have done?" Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jewish leaders. But now my kingdom is from another place." "You are a king then," said Pilate. Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. In fact, the reason I was born and came into the world is to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me." "What is truth?" retorted Pilate. With this, he went out again to the Jews gathered there and said, "I find no basis for a charge against him. But it is your custom for me to release to you one prisoner at the time of Passover. Do you want me to release the King of the Jews?" They shouted back, "No, not him. Give us Barabbas." Now Barabbas had taken part in an uprising. So then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. The soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it upon his head. They clothed him in a purple robe and went up to him again and again, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they slapped him in the face. Once more, Pilate came out and said to the Jews gathered there, "Look, I am bringing him out to you to let you know that I find no basis for a charge against him." When Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, Pilate said to them, "Here is the man." As soon as the chief priests and their officials saw him, they shouted, "Crucify! Crucify!" But Pilate answered, "You take him and crucify him. As for me, I find no basis for a charge against him." The Jewish leaders insisted, "We have a law, and according to that law, he must die, because he claimed to be the Son of God." When Pilate heard this, he was even more afraid, and he went back inside the palace. "Where do you come from?" he asked Jesus, but Jesus gave him no answer. "Do you refuse to speak to me?" Pilate said. "Don't you realize I have power either to free you or to crucify you?" Jesus answered, "You would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin." From then on, Pilate tried to set Jesus free, but the Jewish leaders kept shouting, "If you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar. Anyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar." When Pilate heard this, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judge's seat at a place known as the Stone Pavement, which in Aramaic is Gabbatha. It was the day of preparation of the Passover. It was about noon. "Here is your king," Pilate said to the Jews. But they shouted, "Take him away! Take him away! Crucify him!" "Shall I crucify your king?" Pilate asked. "We have no king but Caesar," the chief priests answered. Finally, Pilate handed him over to be crucified. So when Pilate saw that he was gaining nothing, but rather that a riot was beginning, he took water and washed his hands before the crowd, saying, "I am innocent of this man's blood. See to it yourselves." Pressure from the masses and a weak leader can be deadly. Pilate was in a tough place. He was just doing his job for Rome, and these Jewish leaders were constantly at him about Jesus. When the time came that he was sitting in the judgment seat, his wife came up to him from behind and said, "Have thou nothing to do with that just man, for I have suffered many things this day in a dream because of him." Pilate knew that Jesus was innocent. He hadn't led a revolt. He hadn't been stirring up dissension, calling people out against Rome. In fact, when pressured to answer a question about how they should treat Rome, Jesus answered clearly, "Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and render unto God what is God's." Pilate tried to save Jesus, but he didn't have the nerve to do it alone. What if Rome heard about it? So he offers up a deal. Using an old Jewish tradition, he will release one prisoner. Knowing Jesus' popularity, he's sure Jesus will be released. But he underestimated the cunning of the high priests and the crowds. Those crowds who just 5 days earlier were cheering on their Messiah as he entered into Jerusalem now see him beaten and bloody and looking defeated, and they jump ship and begin crying out, "Free Barabbas." The crowds chose a murderous rebel who in those days deserved to die and exchanged him for an innocent man. At that moment, Pilate, knowing that this is all wrong, literally and figuratively washes his hands of the matter. But isn't this our dilemma as well? If we are not standing firmly in our belief that Jesus is the Messiah, then are we with Pilate, allowing ourselves to be maneuvered into dangerous compromises? Or are we with the crowds, going along with the masses when things get tough? Or are we with the high priests, pressing forward with a political agenda because we're scared? Or are we with Jesus, standing silently in the middle, continuing to be the bearers of God's love in a confused and sometimes hostile world?
The sixth station is when a stranger is called into service. Then Pilate released for them Barabbas, and having scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified. Then the soldiers of the governor took Jesus into the praetorium, and they gathered the whole battalion before him. And they stripped him and put a scarlet robe upon him and plaiting a crown of thorns. They put it on his head and put a reed in his right hand. And kneeling before him, they mocked him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they spat upon him and took the reed and struck him on the head. And when they had mocked him, they stripped him of the robe and put his own clothes back on him and led him away to crucify him. A certain man from Cyrene, Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus, was passing by on his way in from the country, and they forced him to carry the cross. This story epitomizes the worst of humanity. It's an ugly story, and it's a really painful story. And to fully understand the sacrifice Jesus made, you have to know the details. And oftentimes, because those details are so horribly brutal, we skip over them and are okay with saying, "And they took him out and they crucified him." But to fully feel the joy of Easter, you must feel the pain of Good Friday. And so the description that I'm about to share with you is a violent and painful one of what happened when they say they took him out and they crucified him. So as we've heard, the violence against Jesus began very shortly after his arrest. A soldier struck Jesus across the face for remaining silent when questioned by Caiaphas. The palace guards then blindfolded him and mockingly taunted him to identify them as they passed by. And they spat upon him, and they struck him in the face. And throughout the night, Jesus is subjected to these random acts of violence by the Roman guards. Then morning comes, and Pilate orders him to be scourged and released. Now, the Roman flagrum is a short whip consisting of several heavy leather thongs with 2 small balls of lead attached near the ends of each. This heavy whip is brought down with the full force again and again across Jesus' shoulders and back and legs. And at first, those thongs cut through the skin only. But then, as the blows continue, they cut deeper into the skin, first causing a normal type of bleeding, but after the first few whips, those would burst the exposed arteries, causing extensive loss of blood. And those small balls of lead made large, deep bruises, which would open by subsequent blows. And finally, the skin of the back just ends up hanging in long ribbons, and the entire area becomes unrecognizable as a mass of torn, bleeding tissue. And when it's determined by the centurion in charge that the prisoner is near death, that's when the beatings finally stop. So in Jesus' case, the guards finally tire of their sadistic sport, and they tore the robe from his back that they had put on him. The blood would have been dried to his skin by now, so its removal would cause even more excruciating pain. But the Roman guards weren't done there. Flexible branches covered with long thorns were woven into the shape of a crown, and this was pressed onto his scalp. And after mocking him some more and striking him across the face and across the head, driving the thorns deeper into Jesus' scalp, the half-fainting Jesus was then untied, and we can only imagine probably fell to the ground in agony. And that's when this crossbeam was tied across his shoulders, and the procession of the condemned Christ, 2 thieves, and the execution detail of the Roman soldiers would have begun its slow journey along the Via Dolorosa. And in spite of Jesus' efforts to walk erect, the weight of that heavy wooden beam, together with the shock produced by copious blood loss, became too much. He most likely stumbled and fell. He might have tried to get up, but his body would have been broken beyond its capability. So then we can assume the centurion, probably anxious to get on with the crucifixion as Passover was approaching quickly, grabbed an onlooker, Simon of Cyrene, to help carry the cross. Now, this story comes to us from the Gospel of Mark, and it seems like Simon was known to Mark, who mentions his sons. And later, Paul directs some of his messages to Rufus, which is an extremely unfamiliar name at that time in Palestine. And it's believed that Rufus was a follower. But was his father Simon? We don't know. But it could be that he was one of the thousands standing and watching the torture and the death of their Messiah. Now, poor Simon was an unwilling participant in the passion of Christ. Yet he was compelled to pick up the cross. And I can't help but ask, how many times are we asked to help bear the burden of another person in need? Do we see that as an honor, as a blessing? We all have our own crosses to bear, making it easy to pretend not to see the needs or the grief or the suffering around us. It's easy to pretend not to hear the cries for help that come in many forms by those we walk by every day. It's easy to convince ourselves that we're too busy or too tired or have too much on our plates already. But we need to remember that Jesus said, "Come unto me, all ye who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." And when we yoke ourselves to God, all things become possible.
We continue with Station 7, with Jesus speaking to the women. A great number of the people who followed him, and among them were women who were beating their breasts and wailing for him. But Jesus turned to them and said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For the days are surely coming when they will say, 'Blessed are the barren, and the wombs that never bore, and the breasts that never nursed.' Then they will begin to say to the mountains, 'Fall on us,' and to the hills, 'Cover us.' For if they do this when the wood is green, what will happen when it is dry?" How amazing is this moment? Jesus is on the road to his crucifixion, bleeding and in agony, when he sees a group of women following him, already grieving and crying at his impending death. And yet, he stops to talk to them, to comfort them. He is moved beyond his own pain and suffering to give comfort to theirs. But the words he says are not ones we would expect. Instead, they are prophetic words. Even minutes before he is to be hung on the cross, Jesus is trying to teach and share an important message. This is not the worst of times. The worst is still yet to come. If they do this when the wood is green, what will happen when it is dry? If they are treating him, the Prince of Peace, the green wood, this way, what would they do if the Jews rose up, became warriors, dry wood, and declared war on Rome? Ironically, Jesus was not dying the death befitting of a revolutionary, even though he was not one. If this is what they are doing to him, a pacifist, what will they do to your sons? This follows along with an earlier prophecy Jesus made when he said, "Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those sent to you, how often I have longed to gather your children together, as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were not willing." And now he looks at the women and he mourns for them, for those mothers whose sons may die at the hands of the oppressors. And at this time, he gives a kind of reverse beatitude. Whereas before he said, "Blessed are the poor, the meek," here he says, "Blessed are the barren and the wombs that never bore," because they will not have to feel the overwhelming pain that the mothers will when their own sons are killed.
We continue with Station 8, where Jesus is stripped of his garments. And when they came to a place called Golgotha, which means the place of a skull, they offered him wine to drink, mingled with gall. But when he tasted it, he would not drink it. And as they hung him on the cross, Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." When the soldiers had crucified Jesus, they took his clothes and divided them into 4 parts, one for each soldier. They also took his tunic. Now the tunic was seamless, woven in one piece from the top. So they said to one another, "Let us not tear it, but cast lots for it to see who will get it." This was to fulfill what the scripture says, "They divided my clothes among themselves, and for my clothing they cast lots." And that is what the soldiers did. Then they sat down and kept watch over him there. Doesn't it seem like Jesus has suffered enough at this point? It's painful and exhausting to continue to hear about the unnecessary pains that were inflicted upon him. What motivated the Roman soldiers to behave in such a horrid manner? There was no financial gain for them to be dressing him up like a king and pretending to salute him and kneeling down before him. But there was some payback. They had been fighting what we might call rebel terrorists for a long time. Jewish rebels who fought against Rome at every turn. Jews who were desperate for freedom and were ready to do anything. The Roman soldiers had probably had some of their friends die in these battles. They were most likely tired of policing Jerusalem, far away from their homes and their families, and having to deal with these fighters. So, when they get someone who has been accused of trying to make himself king of the Jews, and they knew he was going to die anyways, well, maybe they thought they could have a little fun with him. It's no secret that ancient ways of fighting and treating enemies was nothing short of brutal. So this treatment of Jesus probably didn't shock many. His shame and humiliation were made complete with the soldiers stripping him of his clothes, although it was a normal practice to crucify people naked, and then gambling them away as if he and they were of no importance. But what else happens here? Even in the midst of all this brutality, Jesus reaches out to God and asks forgiveness for these soldiers. Why? Because they have no idea who he really is. They don't understand that the messianic messenger is in front of them. If they don't have this divine knowledge, then how can they be blamed? If God hasn't offered the gift of faith, they clearly cannot be held responsible for not knowing or believing.
Station 9, where Jesus continues to be mocked. And those who passed by hurled insults at him, shaking their heads and saying, "You who would destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, come down from the cross and save yourself. If you are the Son of God, come down from the cross." So also the chief priests with the scribes and elders mocked him, saying, "He saved others, but he cannot save himself. Let this Messiah, this King of Israel, let him come down now from the cross, and we will believe in him. He trusts in God. Let God deliver him now, if he desires. For he said, 'I am the Son of God.'" Pilate had a notice prepared and fastened to the cross. It read, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. Many of the Jews read this sign, for the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city. And the sign was written in Aramaic and Latin and Greek. The chief priests of the Jews protested to Pilate, "Do not write the King of the Jews, but that this man has claimed to be King of the Jews." And Pilate answered, "What I have written, I have written." So the crucifixion scene was ending the exact way it began, with mockery. But this time it comes by Jewish passers-by, as Golgotha was only about 100 yards outside the city walls, including religious leaders. Now, should the Messiah really be dying at the hands of the Romans? Couldn't the King of all lift himself down from the cross? It seemed like everyone wanted in on the game, and foremost on their mind was Jesus' claim, "Destroy this temple and I will rise again in 3 days." A claim that very few, if any, truly understood. He couldn't even rescue himself, they say, let alone destroy and rebuild the temple and the city in 3 days. But of course, Jesus wasn't talking about the temple, the historic buildings they were all living in, which were destroyed in 70 AD, leaving us only the Western Wall. He was talking about himself, the fact that he was the temple, the holy place in which God dwelled. And if they destroyed him, he would rise again in 3 days. And he did just that. And as if the public humiliation of the arrest and mock trials weren't enough, and as if the physical torture added to it wasn't enough, Pilate thought of one more insult to add: a sign claiming Jesus as the King of the Jews. Now, Pilate probably didn't really believe Jesus was the King of the Jews any more than the Jewish leaders had. But it is his final thumb in the nose to those religious leaders. It's almost as if he were thinking, "You made me do this, so here is your so-called king. And I will do to any other so-called king you may think about putting forth the same thing I have done to him." And by writing it in the 3 main languages of the area, he's letting the world know as well. It was common practice to have a sign hanging around the neck of a criminal as they walked to their execution, to let the community know what the consequences were for a particular crime. But this sign instead hung on the cross for all to see, so that all would understand.
And so we come to station 10, where Jesus promises his kingdom to a thief. Then 2 robbers were crucified with him, one on the right and one on the left. And the robbers who were crucified with him also reviled him in the same way. One of the criminals who hung there hurled insults at him. "Aren't you the Messiah? Save yourself and us." But the other criminal rebuked him. "Don't you fear God," he said, "since you are getting under the same sentence. We are punished justly for what we have done through our deeds. This is what we deserve. But this man has done nothing wrong." Then he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." Jesus answered him, "Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." And then there are the 2 robbers. both convicted of real crimes. One joins in the taunting of Jesus, and the other does not. It's almost too easy. This death is the same situation Jesus found himself in from the beginning of his ministry. On the one hand, he had those who believed in him, who believed in God, who wanted to learn and live out God's message of love and peace and salvation for all who believe. Those who bowed to the cowardice of bullying and mocking to buoy themselves up. Those who were threatened by love and preferred protecting their own power instead. The true mystery of God's mercy is unveiled in this act of mercy to the repentant thief, just as it was in his conversation with the women and will be many more times before he dies. Even while Jesus was literally dying, he thought about saving this repentant soul and offered him the first place in paradise, in heaven. Imagine that. The first person welcomed into the kingdom of heaven was a convicted felon, a robber, a sinner. If he could be welcomed, so will we.
And we continue with Station 11, where Jesus speaks to Mary and the disciples. Meanwhile, standing near the cross of Jesus were his mother and his mother's sister, Mary the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing beside her, he said to his mother, "Woman, here is your son." Then he said to the disciple, "Here is your mother." And from that hour, the disciple took her into his own home. This is an incredibly moving moment between Jesus and his mother. Think back to that moment when the disciples tell Jesus that his mother and brothers and sisters were outside, and he responds, "Who is my mother? My brother, my sister? Anyone who believes in me is my mother, my brother, my sister." To some, this is a harsh rejection of his family. But they're wrong. In this moment, Jesus is expanding the concept of family, saying that all who believe are now like mothers and brothers and sisters to each other. But here in this moment, his pure love for his mother shines through. We can see her weeping at the base of the cross, and must know that for a mother, this would be an almost unbearable thing to witness. After he dies, she's going to be alone, a plight he does not want to inflict upon her. So as one last gift to each of them, he looks from his mother to his favorite disciple, John, and unites them, knowing that John, just barely out of his teens, would be devastated at his death, and his mother would be broken apart. But together they could take care of each other. And John does take her into his house, because as a widowed woman with no son to support her, she would eventually have died alone and without a thing to her name. And don't forget, Jesus knew the story was not finished, and they would be able to rejoice together on Easter morning and for the rest of their lives.
After this, when Jesus knew that all was now finished, he said, in order to fulfill the scripture, "I am thirsty." A jar full of sour wine was standing there, so they put a spongeful of the wine on a branch of hyssop and held it to his mouth. And when Jesus had received the wine, he said, "It is finished." There are actually two interesting things happening in these last minutes. First, Jesus lets the people around him know he's thirsty. But isn't he the living water? His first miracle was turning water into wine. So many times in the Bible, he's talking about drinking from the living water that's available to anyone who believes in him. They could satisfy their thirst forever simply by believing in him. So did this mean that the rivers of the living water had dried up? Had the water which had turned into wedding wine, run out for good? Or was there something else going on here? He saved others. Could he not save himself? The answer is no. Just like us, God is the only one who could have saved Jesus. But to do so would strip Jesus of his humanity, to discredit all that he had done, walking this earth as both a man and as the Son of God. Jesus, at this moment, is the most human one can be. He's simply thirsty. And what do they have to give him? Nothing but old sour wine. The wine that only the poorest of the poor would drink. Contrast that to the wine of the first miracle, where his mother Mary insists he turn the water into wine, and not just any wine, she says, high-quality wine. He lets them put this old wine into his mouth, one last act of humility. And then he announces publicly that it is finished. And those words are the other interesting thing here. He has finished the work that God sent him to earth to do. He has loved and forgiven until the very end. He has continued to bring people to God, even as he is stumbling down the road bearing the load of the cross, as well as when he's on the cross. But at that moment, he ends the game. In the original text, the phrase, "it is finished," is actually just one word. It is the same word that people wrote on bills once they were paid. The bill is dealt with. It is finished. The price has been paid. And from that moment on, people can stake their lives on the work that Jesus has done.
Station 13, the death of Jesus. Now from the 6th hour there was a darkness over all the land until the 9th hour. And about the 9th hour Jesus cried out with a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani?" That is, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" And some of the bystanders hearing it said, "This man is calling Elijah." And one of them at once ran and took a sponge, filled it with vinegar, and put it on a reed, and gave it to him to drink. But the others said, "Wait, let us see whether Elijah will come to save him." And Jesus cried again with a loud voice, and yielded up his spirit. And behold, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, and the earth shook, and the rocks were split. The tombs also were opened. When the centurion and those who were with him, keeping watch over Jesus, saw the earthquake and what took place, they were filled with awe and said, "Truly, this was the Son of God." There were also many women there, looking on from afar, who had followed Jesus from Galilee, ministering to him, among whom were Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, and the mother of the sons of Zebedee. My God, why have you forsaken me?" These are powerful words coming from the mouth of the Son of God, which actually makes them all that much more heartbreaking. Jesus knew the scriptures, and this is the first line from the 22nd Psalm. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me, so far from my cries of anguish? There really is no other explanation than understanding that at this moment, and only in this moment in all of his life, the weight of bearing the sins of the world was more than Jesus could handle. It was so heavy that it created a sort of spiritual cloud between Jesus and God, in which Jesus could no longer see or feel God's presence with him. How lonely and painful that moment had to be. He was a broken man in all ways. But God did understand, because as Jesus breathed his last, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, and the earth shook and the rocks were split. In short, God's world broke also. Geologists have now proved that an earthquake took place on April 3rd in the year 33, a Friday, with its epicenter 13 miles outside of Jerusalem at the Dead Sea. An earthquake large enough to cause damage for more than 50 miles. An earthquake large enough to let all those who were watching the death of God's Son know that God's heart was breaking as well. God will not forsake us. God is with us always, even when we can't see it, and until the end of time.
Our final station of the cross, station 14, is the one in which Jesus is placed in the tomb. It was preparation day, that is, the day before the Sabbath, and the Jews did not want the bodies left on the cross during the Sabbath, especially because that Sabbath was a day of great solemnity. So they asked Pilate to have the legs of the crucified men broken and the bodies removed. Then the soldiers came and broke the legs of the first and of the other who had been crucified with him. But when they came to Jesus and saw that he was already dead, they did not break his legs. Instead, one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and at once blood and water came out. He who saw this has testified so that you also may believe. His testimony is true, and he knows that he tells the truth. These things occurred so that the scripture might be fulfilled. None of his bones shall be broken. And again, another passage of scripture says, they will look on the one whom they have pierced. After these things, Joseph of Arimathea, who was a disciple of Jesus, though a secret one because of his fear of the Jews, went boldly to Pilate and asked for Jesus' body. Pilate was surprised to hear that he was already dead. Summoning the centurion, he asked him if Jesus had already died. When he learned from the centurion that it was so, he gave the body to Joseph. So Joseph bought some linen cloth, took down the body, wrapped it in the linen shroud. Nicodemus, who had at first come to Jesus by night, also came, bringing a mixture of myrrh and aloes, weighing about 100 pounds. They took the body of Jesus and wrapped it with the spices in linen cloths, according to the burial customs of the Jews. Now there was a garden in that place where he was crucified, and in the garden there was a new tomb in which no one had ever been laid. And Joseph laid the body in his own new tomb, which he had hewn in the rock. And he rolled a great stone to the door of the tomb and departed. Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, saw where he was laid. Then they went home and prepared spices and perfumes. John is clear when he writes about what happened to Jesus' body after he had died. Can't you imagine that he must have asked himself 1,000 times why he went there, why he didn't stay in hiding like the others? But within a few days he knew. He was the witness. He was the one who needed to tell the story of Jesus Christ, and to do it properly and accurately, he needed to be there. He needed to be there because before too long, people would say that Jesus didn't actually die on the cross. The story of the resurrection was so mind-blowing that it really didn't fit into many people's worldviews, the exception being those who witnessed Jesus resurrect Lazarus and the daughter of Jairus. But consider these facts. The Jews wanted Jesus buried before the Sabbath, as it is against Jewish law to let bodies hang overnight. Pilate hadn't had the men crucified for them to be only half dead, so something had to speed up the death. For the two robbers, the solution was simple. Break the legs, and they would suffocate faster. For Jesus, who was already dead, they decided to stab him with a sword and watch the body fluids run from his body. Only then could they pronounce him truly dead. The burial customs of the time were very different from ours. The tombs were caves hollowed out by hand. This one would have been big enough for 2 or 3 people to walk in, but the doorway would have been small, maybe 4 feet high. To build this was a lot of work. It would be normal for you to have to bury a second body before the first had decomposed. So they wrapped the bodies in white cloth along with a large amount of spices and perfumes. It's interesting to note that Nicodemus brought about 80 pounds with him in today's measurements, 100 times more than Mary Magdalene had poured over Jesus when she was rebuked by the disciples. In between burials, the tomb would be secured against grave robbers by rolling a large, flat stone in a groove in front of the door. John had been there before, waiting outside a tomb while Jesus was called for Lazarus to come out. And now here he is again, waiting. But this time, when the tomb opened, the world would never be the same again.
Together we have traveled on this journey of the cross. In Jesus' journey on the cross on Good Friday, we see his faithfulness in the midst of suffering We see his perseverance in the midst of endings. And we see his courage in the midst of helplessness. On this journey, we too are reminded that sometimes life gets dark. Sometimes life gets painful. And sometimes life brings endings. And that reality won't go away even for the Son of God. But as people of faith, we remember that God does some of God's best work in the darkness as we persist on our own journeys. And so Easter Sunday, Resurrection Sunday, has no meaning without Good Friday. This journey of darkness that we took together is why we can celebrate the journey of life that we will on Easter Sunday. And together, as the faithful people of God, we have learned on this journey to love God more, to love and forgive one another, and to love and forgive ourselves. And that really is the journey that we are on today and every day. And that is what makes us the happy and excited Easter people we will be. But for today, we must sit in the discomfort of pain that life brings, keeping God close by our side, as we pray together the words Jesus taught us by saying, "Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. And give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory forever. Amen."